It is all too common for communists to attack each other using works they do not understand, and there is perhaps no other writing that is used in this manner more often than Lenin's left-wing communism in Infantile Disorder. People will refer to this 1920 pamphlet to discredit tendencies or positions they personally dislike by calling them infantile, despite having no idea what Lenin meant when coining the term. Given the frequent frustration such misused retorts cause, clarifying the meaning of left-wing communism is a worthwhile endeavor, one which can hopefully stop at least one leftist from invoking the work in their next online argument. What better way to do this than by comparing the positions Lenin wrote about to those of everybody's favorite Sud, Amedeo Bordiga. Before we begin comparing the Italian communists' perspectives to Lenin's infamous work, some context is in order. Following the first great imperial conflict, communism was having one of the biggest shakeups in its history since Marx himself was on the scene. The revolutionary period which marked the war's closure provided Marxists with rich historical experience from which they drew conclusions regarding the nature of proletarian struggle. Among these emerged a specific group of Dutch and German thinkers, such as Penning, Koek, and Gorter, who rejected many aspects of the long-established approach Marxism had taken to the class struggle, focusing instead on the self-activity of the working class. Despite their initial enthusiastic support of the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin opposed many of the conclusions these intuitively named German-Dutch left communists had come to, dedicating most of left-wing communism towards them. For future reference, this is the group being alluded to whenever lefts or left communists are spoken of in this video. When examining the thought process of the left communists, Lenin felt they had failed to recognize the international significance of the Bolshevik Revolution. By significance, Lenin did not mean the general impact the events in Russia had had on the rest of the world. These were obvious, as it left the bourgeoisie of all countries anxious of a similar event occurring in their backyard, as seen by the first Red Scare in the United States. Instead, he used the word in a more specific sense, as he clarified in left-wing communism, where he stated,
"Speaking of it in the narrowest sense of the word, taking international significance to mean the international validity or the historical inevitability of a repetition, on an international scale, of what has taken place in our country, it must be admitted that certain fundamental features of our revolution do possess that significance."
These certain fundamental features were limited to the essential political attributes of proletarian dictatorship, along with the process of uncovering the necessary course of action to establish it. Only these specific features would be repeated. Most, if not all, other aspects of the Russian Revolution were not so universal. Soon enough, the workers of Europe and maybe the world over would find themselves confronting the same fundamental task that the workers of Russia had faced: the need to establish their own dictatorship and the consequent need to determine the specific path to achieve it. It was for this reason that Lenin stated in Left-Wing Communism,
"Herein lies the international quote-unquote significance, in the narrowest sense of the word, of Soviet power, and of the fundamentals of Bolshevik theory and tactics."
Here it is shown that Soviet power, having international significance, is a universal aspect of proletarian rule, of what needs to be established. Theory and tactics utilized by the Bolsheviks are presented in a similar manner, but here, as we shall see, they serve as the means by which to establish proletarian rule. In Left-Wing Communism, Lenin explains what Bolshevik theory is, stating that
Bolshevism arose in 1903 on a very firm foundation of Marxist theory. The correctness of this revolutionary theory, and of it alone, has been proved, not only by world experience throughout the 19th century, but especially by the experience of the seekings and vacillations, the errors and disappointments of revolutionary thought in Russia.
Through the theoretical framework Marxism provides, the tactical approach towards establishing proletarian dictatorship is determined on a situational basis. Understanding this relationship between theory and tactics is crucial to understanding why Lenin viewed the communists his pamphlet focused on as being infantile. Lenin's criticism of the left communists begins with their conception of the party, one which he found completely compromised the prospect of a successful proletarian revolution. Certain communists had come to reject what they called the party of leaders in favor of a party of the masses, believing the former could only lead to a dictatorship of the party, while the latter was necessary for achieving a dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin believed this position was utter nonsense. In left-wing communism, his reasoning for this is clear, stating,
"It is common knowledge that the masses are divided into classes, and that the masses can be contrasted with classes only by contrasting the vast majority in general, regardless of division according to status and the social system of production, with categories holding a definite status in the social system of production. That as a rule, and in most cases, at least in present-day civilized countries, classes are led by political parties, that political parties, as a general rule, are run by more or less stable groups composed of the most authoritative, influential, and experienced members who are elected to the most responsible positions and are called leaders."
Essentially, Lenin exposes the dichotomy presented by the lefts to be a false one that ignores the party's very nature. As such, what the party of masses really implied was an outright rejection of the party and its role in the class struggle. From Lenin's perspective, this was a profound mistake which prevented proletarian dictatorship from executing its primary function. Following proletarian seizure of power, the bourgeoisie is bound to resist with a rabid vengeance. Due to international connections, international capital, and the constant revitalization provided by a small production, this resistance must be handled. By waging a long and determined war against the bourgeoisie, the proletarian dictatorship ensures their resistance is fully smothered. Successfully drawing this war to a decisive proletarian victory requires workers to be centralized and disciplined, since the middle strata, the source of that pesky small production, constantly seeks to push the proletariat down the wrong path. Lenin argued that the proletariat could only reach this state with a party. In left-wing communism, he makes this clear, stating,
"Without a party of iron that has been tempered in the struggle, a party enjoying the confidence of all honest people in the class in question, a party capable of watching and influencing the mood of the masses, such a struggle cannot be waged successfully."
A party does not gain this ability out of nowhere. It must develop these qualities by creating specific conditions through prolonged effort and experience. Earlier in left-wing communism, Lenin lists these conditions, stating,
"First, by the class consciousness of the proletarian vanguard and by its devotion to the revolution, by its tenacity, self-sacrifice, and heroism. Second, by its ability to link up, maintain the closest contact, and, if you wish, merge in certain measure with the broadest masses of the working people, primarily with the proletariat, but also with the non-proletarian masses of working people. Third, by the correctness of the political leadership exercised by this vanguard, by the correctness of its political strategy and tactics, provided the broad masses have seen from their own experience that they are correct."
Proletarian dictatorship can only be successful with a party, and a party can only ensure success through a long period of struggle preceding the seizure of power. This is all to say that the party is important at every step of the revolution, both before and after the establishment of a workers' state.
And very plainly, Bordiga agrees with this. When discussing the role the communist theory would play in the labor movements, he states,
"It also denies that the constitution of a new productive organization can be left to the spontaneous and scattered activity of groups of producers shop by shop or trade by trade, the syndicalist position."
Even in his earlier works, such as 1921's Party and Class, Bordiga argues that the Communist Party includes only a part of the class, though it gives the class its unity of action and movement. He even goes so far to denounce tendencies that reject the party form, just as Lenin is doing in LWC, calling them petty bourgeois.
In the only true revolutionary conception, the direction of class action is delegated to the party. Doctrinal analysis, together with a number of historical experiences, allows us to easily reduce to petty bourgeois and anti-revolutionary ideologies any tendency to deny the necessity and the predominance of the party's function. If this denial is based on a democratic point of view, it must be subjected to the same criticism that Marxism uses to disprove the favorite theorems of bourgeois liberalism.
In opposition to activity within trade unions was the next position held by the left communists addressed in Infantile Disorder. Lenin viewed this as being flawed, since it was only through working within trade unions that the party could connect with the broader proletarian class. Within them, workers who had only recently begun organizing could be found. Seeing as they had yet to make the jump from an economic struggle to a political one, Lenin labeled this group the backwards masses of workers. A bond between this broader proletariat and the proletarian party was a necessary condition for proletarian dictatorship. In left-wing communism, Lenin emphasizes this, stating that,
without close contacts with the trade unions, and without their energetic support and devoted efforts, not only in economic but also military affairs, it would have of course been impossible for us to govern the country and to maintain the dictatorship for 2.5 months, let alone 2.5 years.
Such close contacts could only be created and maintained through an active struggle within the trade unions against their ugly nature. Trade unions possess a reactionary and counter-revolutionary character owing to the opportunist leadership and labor aristocracy they give rise to. Only through an active struggle to expose, combat, and displace these union leaders and the labor aristocracy they represent could the masses within the unions be prepared and organized for revolution, elevating their struggle from an economic to a political one. At a certain stage of this struggle, the revolutionary proletariat could seize power based on two factors: whether it had built sufficient influence among the backwards masses of workers to do so, and whether it was positioned to gain additional support from the broader masses through a continued battle against opportunism. Without engaging in this work, workers remain under the direction of opportunist leaders, who serve the interests of the bourgeoisie by sabotaging any revolutionary sentiment or activity that arises within them. For this reason, Lenin stated in Left-Wing Communism,
to refuse to work in reactionary trade unions means leaving the insufficiently developed or backward masses of workers under the influence of the reactionary leaders, the agents of the bourgeoisie. This is so unpardonable a blunder that it is tantamount to the greatest service communists could render the bourgeoisie.
At the time, this was all the more significant, as the masses of European workers were entering the trade unions on an unprecedented scale, demonstrating their strong desire for organization. Despite this, the left communists refused to work within trade unions, forming a gap between themselves and the backward masses of workers when they should have been making closer ties.
An examination of Bordiga's works revealed that he believed working within trade unions to be an essential task of the party given.
Incapable of facing the immense task of the social revolution on its own, the union is, however, indispensable to mobilize the proletariat on a political and revolutionary level. This, however, is possible only if the Communist Party is present and its influence inside the union grows. The party can only work inside entirely proletarian unions where membership is voluntary and where no given political, religious, or social opinions are forced on members.
Through factory groups within the trade unions, the party would influence the workers found within unions. By participating in elections, but not accepting positions, the party was able to maintain autonomy. In doing this, the party was able to make the union an extension of itself, which reached the masses. Despite this view, in the 1950s, Bordiga opposed working with the trade unions. Reactionary and counter-revolutionary sentiment among the union and union leadership was not the reason for this stance. Instead, the position was justified by the fact that in most unions, such as state-run ones, rank-and-file activity had been replaced with bureaucratic process. For Bordiga, this meant that the direct contact with the masses was blocked off, as they were excluded from bureaucratic functions by their very nature. Consequently, Bordiga stated that
the party acknowledges that today, its work in the unions can be done but sporadically. It does not renounce, however, to enter into the economic organizations, and even to gain leadership as soon as the numerical relationship between its members and sympathizers on the one hand, the union members or a given branch on the other is suitable, so long as the union in question does not exclude all possibility of autonomous class action.
this is where practical abstention differs from outright boycott. In the former, the party does not participate in union activity, but it also does not disencourage workers from joining and participating in unions. By doing this, the party leaves open the possibility of engaging with unions once more in the future, when the conditions again called for it.
Another gripe Lenin had with the left communists was their declaration that parliamentarism, participation in parliament, could not be used in a revolutionary manner and must be abandoned. This seemed to contradict the historical experience of the Bolsheviks, who had found engaging in parliamentary activity to have yielded tremendous benefits which only helped advance the class struggle. When examining the factors which made this the case in Russia, there seemed to be no reason parliamentarism couldn't yield similar results in Western Europe. As long as the masses had faith in the bourgeois state, something the lefts regarded as a fact, it was wise for the Revolutionary Party to run in elections and take positions in parliament. In doing so, these masses could be shown that the state worked against their interest, allowing the party to gain support from them necessary to destroy it. Consequently, when speaking of when parliamentarianism had use, Lenin stated that,
"The point is not whether bourgeois parliaments have existed for a long time or a short time, but how far the masses of the working people are prepared, ideologically, politically, and practically, to accept the Soviet system, and to dissolve the bourgeois democratic parliament, or allow it to be dissolved."
This effectively used parliament as a sort of pressure gauge measuring the revolutionary readiness of the masses, a major benefit Engels had originally identified universal suffrage to provide. Being inside Parliament also provided the party with additional perks, such as Lenin's point that the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly was aided by Bolshevik opposition from within. It is important to clarify that Lenin's position was not that Parliament must always be participated in, and that a refusal to work in Parliament must always be rejected. Instead, it was the party's responsibility to assess the situation in order to determine which tactic to engage in. In left-wing communism, Lenin openly acknowledges this, stating,
"I cannot attempt here to formulate the conditions under which a boycott is successful, since the object of this pamphlet is far more modest, namely, to study Russian experience in connection with certain topical questions of international communist tactics. Russian experience has provided us with one successful and correct instance, 1905, and another that was incorrect, 1906, of the use of a boycott by the Bolsheviks."
The only electoral boycott the Bolsheviks had engaged in provided no unique insight into a situation which deviates from the line already set by Lenin, seeing as it occurred at a time when the masses were growing disillusioned with the state and grouping themselves around the revolutionary proletariat. In 1920s Europe, this was not the case, making revolutionary parliamentarism the default position. Despite this, Lenin says nothing implying other situations demanding boycott could not exist. Russian experience simply never revealed any other. If you're interested in a more extensive explanation of why the Bolsheviks worked in parliament, we recommend our video, Lenin Loved Democracy.
Yeah, RoseMedia did a fine enough job explaining revolutionary parliamentarianism in that video, but they completely botched Bordiga's abstentionism. The truth is, the Italian, just like Lenin, came to a completely different conclusion when examining the situation in Europe. Following the First World War, the central task for communists in Western Europe became the immediate establishment of proletarian dictatorship. Achieving this required purging the deep-rooted democratic prejudices and illusions fostered within the masses by long-standing parliamentary regimes. While Bordiga conceded that in contexts like revolutionary Russia, participation in parliament could advance this process, he argued that in the West, it was counterproductive. This can be seen in his thesis on abstentionism, where Bordiga stated,
"In the present historical period, there is no possibility of using the parliamentary tribune for communist revolutionary work, and the clarity of propaganda, no less than the efficiency of the preparation for the final struggle for the dictatorship, demands that communists conduct an agitation for an election boycott by the workers."
When referring to the present historical period, Bordiga was specifically speaking of countries where the democratic revolution had long been completed, unlike Russia where it's still in progress. In the West, participation in bourgeois elections inherently reinforced these illusions by legitimizing the very framework the revolution aimed to destroy, necessitating a complete break. Moreover, participation organizationally corrupted the Revolutionary Party, diverting all of its energy and resources into parliamentary activity, and thereby sabotaging the urgent work of preparing for the proletarian conquest of power. The resulting policy was abstentionism, meaning the party appeared on ballots but refused to take any seat. This approach aimed to achieve the propagandistic benefits of electoral participation while avoiding the drawbacks of parliamentary engagement. By urging workers to waste their votes on the Communist Party, the party agitated for the position that the bourgeois state could not address their needs. Ironically, this tactic echoes the praise Engels gave universal suffrage as a tool for revolutionary parties, where he argued that At a minimum, elections served as a means to gauge popular support. Although Engels noted several additional benefits, he maintained that even if measuring support was the only benefit universal suffrage supplied, it was a worthy tactic as it demonstrated the masses' readiness to dissolve the state.
The final shortcoming of the left communists, substantial enough to warrant an entire chapter, was their complete opposition towards compromises. Lenin felt that this position went against a fundamental truth of Marxism, pointing to the critique of the Blanquist Communard Manifesto by Engels. In this work, communists are defined by their ability to pursue the movement's final aim, communism, against all troubles, stops, and compromises. No straightforward, easy path towards this existed. Setbacks were to be expected, mistakes were to be made, none of which should deter the Revolutionary Party from the finishing line. As such, Lenin stated,
"Proletarians schooled in numerous strikes to take only this manifestation of the class struggle, usually assimilate in admirable fashion the very profound truth, philosophical, historical, political, and psychological, expounded by Engels. Every proletarian has been through strikes and has experienced compromises with the hated oppressors and exploiters. When the workers have had to return to work either without having achieved anything or else agreeing to only a partial satisfaction of their demands."
Compromises were not inherently good or bad. The critical distinction for Lenin was between those that were a necessary maneuver and those that constituted an opportunist betrayal. For instance, Lenin believed that in countries where the socialist revolution first takes place, the proletariat is far weaker than the bourgeoisie, meaning if workers are to beat their capitalist class, any division between capitalists, either at home or abroad, must be taken advantage of through compromises and alliances. With this in mind, the Bolsheviks made numerous compromises with numerous parties which were treacherous and counter-revolutionary, as Lenin stated in Left-Wing Communism.
Prior to the downfall of Tsarism, the Russian Revolutionary Social Democrats made repeated use of the services of the bourgeois liberals, i.e. they concluded numerous practical compromises with the latter. In 1901 to 1902, even prior to the appearance of Bolshevism, the old editorial board of Iskra concluded a formal political alliance with Struve, the political leader of bourgeois liberalism, while at the same time being able to wage an unremitted and most merciless ideological and political struggle against bourgeois liberalism and against the slightest manifestation of its influence in the working class movement. The Bolsheviks have always adhered to this policy.
All of these compromises were made with the final goal of the working class in mind. By disposing of Tsarism, capitalism would be allowed to further mature, providing better conditions for proletarian revolution to take root. Only by maintaining the autonomy of the working class could said revolution have any hopes of succeeding. Compromises did not necessarily lead to opportunism or a watering down of the revolution, but were real and legitimate tools within the arsenal of class warfare.
Now, this does sort of tie into the previous point we discussed on parliamentarianism, as the main root of their disagreement on compromise links back to Bordiga's stance on parliamentarianism. For Bordiga, engagement with the bourgeoisie wasn't just a tactical error, but a theoretical one. By compromising with bourgeois parties, engaging in their elections, you not only recognize their political stance as legitimate, but also one legitimate enough for you to be buddy-buddy with. It left the door wide open for a reformist wing to step foot into the Communist Party, and it was ultimately a futile endeavor as the ruling class elections were, guess what, owned and run by the ruling class.
An ever-growing contradiction between the productive forces and relations of production develops within the present capitalist social system, engendering the antagonism of interests and the class struggle between the proletariat and the ruling bourgeoisie. The present relations of production are protected by bourgeois state power. No matter what form of representative system, no matter what use may or may not be made of electoral democracy, the bourgeois state always constitutes the organ for defending the interests of the capitalist class. The proletariat can neither destroy nor change the system of capitalist relations of production from which its exploitation derives without overthrowing bourgeois power by means of violence.
There seems to be a very clear fault line between the two, however it may not be as irreconcilable as you would expect. As we've covered, Bordiga did state that the only time it would be permissible for communists, and more broadly, the Communist Party, could ally with non-communists was in the cases, nations, where neither capitalism nor the bourgeoisie had fully developed, e.g. in colonies and the few nations which still predominantly featured the feudal mode of production, like Russia.
In Europe and America, strategical alliance with left bourgeois movements against feudal forms of power is no longer possible and has given way to direct struggle by the proletariat for power. But in underdeveloped countries, the rising proletarian and communist parties will not disdain to participate to insurrections of other anti-feudal classes, either against local despotic dominations or against the white colonizers.
On top of this, Bordiga repeatedly warned against unflinching dogmatism within the communist movement, especially in regards to compromises.
It is impossible, unless we want to give way to idealism or to mystical, ethical, or aesthetic considerations, which are in complete opposition to Marxism, to assert that in all historical phases of the proletarian movement, the same intransigence is necessary, that any alliance, any united front, all compromise is to be refused on principle. Quite on the contrary, it is only on a historical basis that the questions of class and party strategy and tactics can be solved. For this reason, it is the development of the proletarian class throughout the world between the bourgeois and socialist revolutions which must be considered, and not particularities of time and place that nourish casuistical politics and which leave practical questions on the whims of groups or steering committees.
So again, this seems like a difference in material conditions which have influenced Lenin and Bordiga's position.
So based on his disagreements with Lenin on matters such as parliamentarism and compromises, Bordiga must have been an infantile, right? Well, if the Italian communist is to be taken at his word, this is not the case. In a condemnation of the renegades to come, Bordiga spoke of the relationship certain communists had with Lenin's famous pamphlet, stating that
they are of course interested in left-wing communism for the passages hundreds of times, always cheating, quoted against the Italian left, although they are for the most part commendatory.
Yes, your ears do not deceive you. Bordiga stated that most of what was presented in left-wing communism, in terms of specific tactical applications, was optional, not mandatory. Instead, the work's central point, which needed to be followed without exception, was in regards to the role and nature of the party. Based on this, Bordiga stated that Lenin's main concern was
the danger of a belittlement of the primary function of the party, as well as the fear of the party dictatorship, a real, classical condemnation of the overworked, immediately in workerist anti-politicism.
For the most part, every other point presented in the work was a way of reinforcing this elementary and essential principle. Rather than each of them coming together to form a model which was universally applicable everywhere, the tactics presented were meant to be pursued by a revolutionary party based on an assessment of the situation. As a result, Bordiga, in the same work, stated that
the sense of the work of Lenin at the eve of the study on the tactical arsenal of international communism was this: there are historical stages that can be discarded on principle, but there are no tactical means to be discarded on principle.
From an Italian POV, left-wing communism was meant to show that as a revolutionary party, the Bolsheviks were able to look at the conditions at hand and use the right tactics accordingly. This process of observation and decision was what the takeaway was, not the conclusions themselves which the Bolsheviks had come to. Tactics presented were entirely based on such a party, without which they were nothing. Now, Bordiga's argument here is all fine and dandy, but is it actually substantiated by the content of left-wing communism itself? Throughout the 1920 pamphlet, Lenin constantly stresses the importance of the party, granting validity to Bordiga's interpretation. A significant chunk of left-wing communism is entirely devoted to explaining how crucial the party was in the Russian Revolution, along with the conditions and history which had made this the case. It isn't until roughly halfway through that Lenin dedicates a chapter directly addressing the left-wing communists, beginning with their flawed conception of the party. While the following chapters all heavily scrutinize various tactics Lenin took issue with, they were always mentioned in relation to the party, something we have hopefully demonstrated. Compromises, participation in parliament, even union activity were not presented as important in themselves, but in how they could be used by the party based on an assessment of the situation at hand. It is completely undeniable that Lenin presented his own interpretation of the approach called for by European conditions, one which could even be said to be biased by his own experience. Despite this, he always made it clear that deciding tactics was ultimately the responsibility of a truly revolutionary party directly dealing with these conditions. What was infantile was the failure of a party to properly engage in this analysis, or the outright rejection of the party itself, the only body capable of this task. Focusing on the tactics themselves and treating left-wing communism as a word-for-word guide is a fundamental mistake. As Lenin himself stated in Left-Wing Communism,
to carry on a war for the overthrow of the international bourgeoisie, a war which is 100 times more difficult, protracted, and complex than the most stubborn of ordinary wars between states, and to renounce in advance any change of tack or any utilization of conflict of interest, even if temporary, among one's enemies, or any conciliation or compromise with possible allies, even if they are temporary, unstable, vacillating, or conditional allies, is that not ridiculous in the extreme? Is it not like making a difficult ascent of an unexplored and hitherto inaccessible mountain and refusing in advance ever to move in zigzags, ever to retrace one's steps, or ever to abandon a course once selected and to try others?
the same could be said about tactics which worked for the Bolsheviks. They cannot be blindly repeated, instead they must be utilized if the situation calls for it. A quick glance at tactics such as revolutionary parliamentarism showed this to be the case.
Bordiga was correct on his position on parliamentarianism, even though it split from Lenin's. We can really understand this as a difference in the material conditions in Russia and in Italy. Whilst parliamentarianism worked for Lenin, the Italian situation was much different, notably because of the rise of Mussolini and of fascism. In a letter to Trotsky, Lenin wrote,
About Bordiga, I very strongly advise the adoption of your proposal that we send a letter from our CC to the Italian delegates and insistently recommend that they adopt the tactics you have outlined. Otherwise, the actions of the latter will be highly harmful to the Italian communists in everything they subsequently do.
This was in reference to the 4th Congress of the Comintern, merging the Socialist and Communist parties of Italy, a choice that Bordiga's sect broke away from. The Bolshevik Central Committee sent a letter to the Italian Communist Party asking them to not vote against the merger. However, the Italian Communist Party denied the request. This would mean that Bordiga would have to ally with Togliatti. But why? Well, it was to try and tackle fascism, taken from the thesis of the Comintern tactics.
One of the most important tasks of the communist parties is to organize resistance to international fascism. They must be at the head of the working class in the fight against their fascist gangs, must be extremely active in setting up united fronts on the question, and must make use of illegal methods of organization.
If you're already acquainted with Bordiga's works, you can definitely see some stark differences between his analysis of fascism and how to combat it, compared to the Comintern's. A united front of communists would not have stopped Mussolini's rise to power, as he was executed both forcefully and democratically. I.e., even if a united front was formed by Bordiga and Togliatti, they wouldn't have been able to vote away fascism. As Bordiga wrote, the communist movement cannot ally itself into united fronts with counter-revolutionary forces, for it dilutes the true purpose of revolution, even if it's for the noble cause of stopping fascism.
It is no wonder, therefore, that, beginning by simple contacts with the social betrayers and social patriots rejected the day before, continuing with united fronts, workers' governments, renouncing to class dictatorship, and even blocs with petty bourgeois parties, the Moscow movement fell, during the war, into total enslavement of the policy of democratic powers. Later, it had to admit that these powers were not only imperialist, but just as fascist as Germany and Italy had been before. It is therefore no wonder either that the revolutionary parties which had met in Moscow in 1919 to 1920 had lost any remainder of their communist and proletarian nature.
This isn't to say Lenin was flat out wrong. His methodology worked out for Russia, however, he was wrong for advising tactics that wouldn't work under the Italian situation. Lenin's parliamentarianism was part of a larger, permanent revolution that was viable in a nation that did not have a solid proletariat, but instead an enormous amount of people within the peasantry. The proletariat could not consolidate their dictatorship fully and thus were forced into making concessions. The Italian situation did not call for this, as workers were majority proletariat, meaning they would have the strength to take power and establish a dictatorship, not needing to engage in bourgeois elections. It should not be controversial to state that Lenin simply did not understand the Italian situation as well as he understood the Russian one. This is fully expected. Lenin is not infallible, for he is just a man, and we are not heretics for pointing this out, since Marxism is not a religion.
Having compared the positions attacked in left-wing communism to those held by Bordiga himself, we can comfortably say that Bordiga was not an infantile. Despite disagreeing on a few notable tactics, such as compromises and parliamentarism, at the end of the day, the Italian agreed with the work's most crucial point: a truly revolutionary party is necessary if proletarian revolution is to succeed. Rejection of the party's role in class struggle, or the outright rejection of the party itself, was what Lenin identified as being an infantile disorder. Individual tactics refuted in his pamphlet only served to show why this was the case, since a major task of the party was a thorough examination of the conditions at hand to determine tactics on a theoretical basis. While Lenin initially observed what he called to be an infantile disorder in the German-Dutch left communists, it is important to clarify that this characteristic is not exclusive to them. Anyone who takes a similar approach to the party fits the necessary criteria for being diagnosed with the disorder. By failing to determine the proper approach called for by a situation, or by obsessing over tactics left-wing communism presented, even those who swear by the party can be labeled as infantile. Alright, this is just gonna serve as like some end credit shit, I guess, but like thank you to Unajoy, because she helped make this video. She came up with the idea in the first place like almost a fucking year ago, and you know, that was a great idea. Thank you for helping write the script and do some research. Very much appreciated. And her channel is in the link in the description below. Check out the video that is in your recommended, that is hopefully from us. Bye.